Dad, do you know why the Army pays me? I looked my dad straight in the eye. Tell your wife to stop counting my money. She doesn't have a right to a single dollar of it. If she crosses that line again, I won't be polite anymore. Do you understand? My dad went pale. For 7 years, I kept quiet while my stepmom slowly bled my father's life savings dry. I ignored the subtle hints, the fake concern, and the constant demand for financial help every time I came home on leave. But when she breached my personal bank account, forged my signature, and redirected a massive chunk of my military combat pay to fund her biological son's reckless lifestyle, the soldier in me took over. She thought my silence was weakness, but she was about to learn that military discipline works both ways. My name is Major Julia Vance. I'm 31 years old, serving active duty in the United States Army. After an exhausting 11-month deployment overseas, stepping off the transport plane back onto Texas soil felt like coming home to sanctuary. I expected heat, I expected quiet, and I expected to finally rest. What I didn't expect was a ghost waiting inside my bank account. Standing in the terminal, I opened my credit union app to clear a routine transfer. My heart stopped. My high-yield savings account, where every single dollar of my combat deployment pay was supposed to sit untouchable, had been gutted. A massive 5-figure sum had been wired out just 3 days prior. No alert, no phone call, just gone. My immediate thought was high-level cyber fraud, but when I pulled up the authorization receipt, the digital signature made my stomach churn. It wasn't a stranger. It was a name tied directly to my past. Less than 2 hours later, I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. The Texas sun beat down on the pavement, but a cold knot was tightening in my gut. I grabbed my duffel bag, took a deep breath to settle the military discipline in my chest, and pushed open the front door. The house smelled like fresh coffee and familiar wood, but the atmosphere inside was thick with tension. I walked into the living room, staring down at my dad, Arthur, and my stepmom, Brenda. They didn't know it yet, but my deployment wasn't over. It had just shifted home. Brenda had been married to my dad for 8 years, and from day one, she treated my father's hard-earned retirement like her personal ATM. But her worst trait wasn't just her own greed. It was her absolute indulgence of her 24-year-old son, Kyle. Kyle was a professional slacker who moved from one failed hustle to another, refusing to keep a steady job while expecting the world to fund his lifestyle. Over the years, the subtle financial demands were constant. Whenever I came home on leave, Brenda would find a way to drop hint after hint. First, it was a small loan because Kyle had backed his car into a streetlight and couldn't afford the insurance deductible. Then it was help with his rent because he was finding himself. Every time my dad yielded, draining his own savings just to keep peace in the house. I had warned my dad repeatedly that he was enabling a parasite, but Brenda always spun it as family obligation. This time, however, Brenda hadn't bothered asking for a loan. Standing in their living room, watching Brenda sip her tea with a smug, untroubled smile, pieces of the puzzle began aggressively falling into place. Just 2 days ago, my dad had proudly sent me a text mentioning that Kyle had somehow acquired a brand new, fully customized lifted pickup truck, a vehicle that cost easily upwards of $30,000. Kyle hadn't worked a full 40-hour week in 2 years. I looked from Brenda's relaxed posture to my dad's tired eyes, and the sickening reality hit me. She hadn't just counted my money while I was away in a combat zone. She had taken it to buy her son a trophy. I didn't storm into the living room making wild accusations. Military intelligence taught me one fundamental rule: never engage without verified targets. So, early the next morning, I took my military power of attorney documents, active duty orders, and military ID, heading straight to the main branch of my credit union. The branch manager, a veteran himself, took one look at my uniform and my account history before pulling up the back-end transaction files. What he uncovered was a calculated breach. When I was 17, my dad had set up a joint youth checking account with me at this very bank. Years ago, I had moved my primary funds to a private military high-yield account, assuming the old account was long closed. Brenda, however, had kept the old paperwork tucked away. Exploiting a loophole in the system, she had linked that ancient signature card to my active military account. Then, utilizing an outdated power of attorney form, she had forged my father's signature to authorize a direct $35,000 wire transfer straight into Kyle's personal checking account. The manager's face turned grim as he printed out the paper trail. The forged authorization slip, the wire transfer confirmation, and the IP address logs pointing directly to my dad's home router. I sat in that office and watched every piece of evidence compile into a bulletproof legal record. Brenda thought she was being clever, hiding behind outdated bank forms and stolen signatures. She had no idea that every document she generated was just another piece of evidence building my case. I gathered the certified paper trail, slipped the folder into my bag, and prepared to execute my counterstrike. That evening, Brenda insisted on hosting a celebratory welcome home dinner. She set the table with her finest china, acting like the picture-perfect supportive stepmother. Kyle sat across from me, repeatedly twirling his new truck keys on his index finger, while loudly pontificating about his new auto-customization business venture. Brenda beamed at him, nodding in fake pride, while my dad sat quietly at the head of the table, looking exhausted and worn down. I waited until Brenda was mid-sentence, boasting about how Kyle was finally taking initiative in his life, before I reached into my bag. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hands on the table. With measured, deliberate precision, I pulled out the manila folder and laid the printed bank records, the forged signature cards, and the wire transfer receipts flat on the tablecloth right between my dad's plate and Brenda's wine glass. The room dropped into instant, suffocating silence. "What is this, Julia?" my dad asked, his brows furrowing as he reached for the top page. "That, Dad, is the paper trail showing how $35,000 of my combat pay was stolen while I was overseas," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. I locked eyes with my stepmom, watching the color drain from her face as she recognized the credit union seal. "Dad, do you know why the Army pays me?" I looked my dad straight in the eye. "Tell your wife to stop counting my money. She doesn't have a right to a single dollar of it. If she crosses that line again, I won't be polite anymore. Do you understand?" My dad went pale, his hands trembling as he read the forged signature bearing his own name. Kyle stopped twirling his keys, staring in stunned silence, while Brenda sat frozen, caught dead in the sights of her own crime. Brenda's composure shattered instantly. Her eyes welled with sudden practiced tears as she slapped her hand over her mouth. "Julia, how could you accuse me of something so terrible?" she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I did it for this family." Kyle needed startup capital for a legitimate business. We were going to pay every single cent back before you even got off deployment. "With what money, Brenda?" I demanded, my tone icy cold. "Kyle hasn't earned a real paycheck in 2 years. You stole combat pay from an active duty officer." My dad looked like he had been physically struck. He stared at the forged signature on the document, then looked up at me with pleading eyes. "Julia, please," he stammered, his voice desperate to keep the peace. "She made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we can handle this inside the family. Let it slide just this once, and I will personally pay you back out of my retirement funds over time. Don't do something that destroys this home." "No, Dad," I said, leaning forward so there was zero room for misunderstanding. "You've been enabling her financial abuse for 8 years, but it ends today. You have a choice to make right now. Either you hold your wife accountable and force her to return every penny, or I walk out that door and let the bank's fraud department and the military legal office handle it. Choose." Neither Brenda nor Kyle said a word as I picked up my folder, walked out of the house, and drove straight to the military legal assistance office. I wasn't going to sit around hoping for a miraculous apology. By 9 o'clock the following morning, I had submitted a formal, sworn affidavit of forgery and unauthorized electronic funds transfer to my credit union's corporate fraud division, backed by the JAG office's official documentation. Because the funds involved active-duty military combat pay and crossed state lines via wire transfer, the financial institution moved with ruthless velocity. They froze Kyle's bank accounts instantly, locking down every dollar remaining from the illicit transaction. When the credit union notified Kyle's dealership that the funds used for his down payment were under an active criminal fraud investigation, the dealership repossessed his brand-new customized truck right out of the driveway 48 hours later. Watching the tow truck pull away with Kyle's prized possession was the reality check Brenda never saw coming. With the bank initiating a full criminal recovery process, Brenda faced mandatory restitution orders and potential felony indictment for bank fraud and identity theft unless she surrendered every personal asset she possessed to repay the balance immediately. For my dad, watching the legal system dismantle his wife's deception was the cold shower he desperately needed. The paper trail proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brenda had been manipulating him for years, forging his name without a second thought to fund her son's lifestyle. The blinders finally fell from his eyes. Staring at the empty driveway where Kyle's truck used to sit, my dad realized that in trying to save his marriage, he had nearly allowed his wife to destroy his daughter's life. 2 weeks later, my dad filed for divorce, officially ending an 8-year marriage built on deception and financial leeching. Facing the terrifying prospect of a felony fraud conviction, Brenda was forced to liquidate her personal savings and sell off her jewelry to pay back every last cent of the $35,000 she had stolen from me. Kyle was forced to pack his bags and move into a cheap, single-room apartment, finally taking a minimum-wage job to pay off his own mounting debts. For the first time in years, my dad and I sat on the front porch without the dark cloud of manipulation hanging over us. He apologized with tears in his eyes, admitting how blind he had been to Brenda's greed and thanking me for having the strength to pull him back from the edge. I placed a hand on his shoulder, letting him know that while the path had been painful, we had finally reclaimed our peace. Standing up to family isn't easy, especially when it involves the people who are supposed to protect you. But as an Army officer, I learned that setting firm, unbreakable boundaries isn't an act of malice. It's an act of self-preservation. I reclaimed my money, saved my father from ruin, and proved that no one gets to exploit my sacrifices under the guise of family. Now, I'm stepping into my next chapter with my head held high, knowing that my sanctuary is finally secure.